In 1962, an American Army captain arrived in Hereford, England. He expected to meet Britain's finest warriors. Instead, he found men with unpolished boots. No parade ground discipline. No obsession with rank. Some were even drinking tea. To him, they looked like amateurs. Captain Charles Beckwith had already fought in Korea, led covert operations in Asia, and completed some of the toughest training the United States Army could offer. He thought he knew what elite soldiers looked like. He was wrong, because hidden behind that relaxed appearance was a unit forged in jungle wars, hardened by impossible selection, and feared by enemies across the world. Over the next few months, Beckwith would witness something that challenged everything he believed about military excellence. The lesson would stay with him for 15 years. Through war, through failure, and through two brushes with death. Then, after a national crisis exposed a dangerous weakness in American special operations, Beckwith would finally get his chance. His mission was simple: build a unit capable of doing what only one force in the world had truly mastered. Hostage rescue, counterterrorism, precision warfare. The result would become Delta Force. But before America could create its most secretive warriors, one question had to be answered. What made the SAS so effective that every Special Forces unit on Earth eventually tried to copy them? This is the story of Charles Beckwith, the SAS, Delta Force, and the moment modern special operations changed forever. The train rolled into Hereford on a grey autumn morning in 1962. Captain Charles Beckwith stepped onto the platform carrying more than luggage. He carried confidence. The kind of confidence earned through years of military service, combat experience, and hard-won reputation. At 33 years old, Beckwith was already considered one of the rising stars of the United States Army. He had served in Korea. He had worked on dangerous assignments in Southeast Asia. He had completed Ranger School and proven himself among America's toughest soldiers. In his mind, he already knew what an elite military unit looked like. And he was about to meet Britain's most famous Special Forces regiment, the Special Air Service, the SAS. What happened next would completely shatter his expectations. When Beckwith arrived at the regiment's headquarters in Hereford, he expected an atmosphere of strict military discipline. He imagined spotless uniforms, perfectly polished boots, soldiers standing rigidly to attention, officers separated from enlisted men by an unmistakable wall of rank and authority. Instead, he found something entirely different. The men looked relaxed. Some wore worn uniforms. Others appeared almost casual. There was laughter. There were jokes. The atmosphere felt strangely informal. One sergeant spoke to an officer with a level of familiarity that would have been unthinkable in most military organizations. To Beckwith, it looked wrong. Everything about it seemed wrong. These were supposed to be Britain's elite warriors. Instead, they looked like men who had forgotten military discipline altogether. Years later, Beckwith would admit that his first impression was far from positive. In fact, he thought the SAS looked like amateurs. But first impressions can be dangerously misleading, because what Beckwith could not see was the history hidden behind those relaxed faces. The SAS had been born during the chaos of the Second World War. Its founder, a young British officer named David Stirling, believed conventional warfare was too slow, too predictable, and too rigid. His solution was revolutionary. Instead of massive armies fighting head-on, he envisioned small teams operating deep behind enemy lines. Teams that could move fast, strike hard, and disappear before anyone knew they had been there. The idea sounded reckless. At times, it sounded insane. Yet it worked. Again and again. By the end of the war, the SAS had earned a reputation for accomplishing missions that many believed impossible. But the regiment's greatest test would come after the war had ended. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Britain found itself fighting a brutal conflict in Southeast Asia known as the Malayan Emergency. The enemy rarely wore uniforms. They avoided direct battles. They melted into dense jungle whenever conventional forces approached. Many military units struggled to adapt. The SAS did not. Instead of forcing the jungle to obey them, they learned how to live inside it. For weeks at a time, Small patrols disappeared into terrain that most soldiers considered impossible. They tracked insurgents through thick vegetation, gathered intelligence, conducted ambushes, and survived in conditions that broke ordinary men. By the time Beckwith arrived in Hereford, these experiences had transformed the regiment. The SAS had learned a lesson few military organizations fully understood. Success was not about looking professional. It was about being effective. The mission mattered. Everything else was secondary. That philosophy shaped every part of the regiment. Rank mattered less than competence. Experience carried more weight than appearance. Results spoke louder than ceremony. To many outsiders, the culture seemed almost rebellious. To the men inside the SAS, it was simply practical. And that practicality produced extraordinary results. At first, Beckwith remained skeptical. Years of military tradition had taught him to judge soldiers by standards that the SAS seemed to ignore. But he had not come to Hereford merely to observe. He had come to serve alongside them. Soon, he would train with them, patrol with them, and experience firsthand what separated these seemingly ordinary men from every other military unit he had ever encountered. The lessons would begin in the mountains. And before long, Charles Beckwith would discover that the most dangerous soldiers in the world often looked nothing like the image he had carried in his head. The tea-drinking amateurs of Hereford were about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Charles Beckwith's opinions did not change overnight. Even after arriving in Hereford, part of him remained unconvinced. The SAS culture was certainly different. But different did not necessarily mean better. If these men were truly the world's finest special operators, then sooner or later they would have to prove it. That moment arrived in the mountains of Wales. The place was known as the Brecon Beacons. Beautiful from a distance, brutal up close. For generations, these windswept hills had served as one of the SAS's most unforgiving testing grounds. The landscape looked harmless enough. Rolling green slopes, thick fog, open countryside stretching to the horizon. But appearances were deceptive. The weather could change in minutes. Visibility could vanish without warning. Rain turned the ground into a swamp. Strong winds cut through clothing and skin alike. The mountains had a reputation. They did not care how strong a man believed he was. Sooner or later, they revealed the truth. Beckwith watched as SAS candidates began their selection process. There were no instructors screaming into faces. No dramatic speeches. No elaborate ceremonies. The system was remarkably simple. Candidates received a map, a compass, a destination. Then they were told to move. Alone. No teammates. No encouragement. No second chances. Each man carried heavy equipment across miles of difficult terrain. Hour after hour. Day after day. The pace increased. The distances grew longer. The burden became heavier. One by one, candidates disappeared. Some quit voluntarily. Others reached their physical limits. A few simply broke under the pressure. The mountains showed no mercy. What shocked Beckwith was not the difficulty. It was the philosophy behind it. Most military organizations focused on teaching skills first. The SAS focused on finding the right people. Skills could be learned later. Character could not. The selection process was designed to answer a single question. When everything becomes painful, exhausting, and uncertain, who keeps moving? Because combat rarely rewards the strongest man. It rewards the man who refuses to stop. As the days passed, Beckwith began to understand that the SAS operated according to entirely different principles. There was very little concern for appearances. No one cared how impressive a candidate looked. No one cared how loudly he talked. No one cared about his previous reputation. The mountains stripped away every illusion. Only performance mattered. Only results mattered. For Beckwith, it was a revelation. Back in the United States, elite military training often emphasized standards, discipline, and organizational structure. The SAS emphasized individual responsibility. A soldier was expected to think independently, adapt independently, survive independently. If an operator needed constant supervision, he did not belong in the regiment. This approach created a unique type of warrior. Men capable of functioning far from support, far from headquarters, far from immediate help. Men who could make life-and-death decisions without waiting for orders. The more Beckwith observed, the more he realized that what had appeared to be a lack of discipline was actually something else entirely. Confidence. The SAS did not need constant displays of authority because its standards were already understood. Every man had earned his place. Every man knew what was expected. That understanding created a level of trust rarely found elsewhere. But the lessons did not end in Wales. Soon Beckwith would accompany SAS patrols on exercises and operational deployments. There, he witnessed another aspect of the regiment that left a lasting impression. Its obsession with preparation. SAS operations often appeared effortless from the outside. Targets were reached. Missions were completed. Teams returned safely. But beneath that success lay meticulous planning. Routes were studied. Contingencies were prepared. Every possible problem was considered before the mission began. The operators were expected to adapt when plans failed. But they prepared so thoroughly that failure became far less likely. Again and again, Beckwith saw the same pattern. The SAS rejected unnecessary tradition. Yet it demanded excellence. It tolerated informality. Yet it enforced extraordinary standards. The contradiction fascinated him. These men looked relaxed because they were competent. They were confident because they were prepared. And they were effective because the regiment focused relentlessly on what actually worked. By the end of his exchange with the SAS, Beckwith had undergone a complete transformation. The skepticism that had accompanied him to Hereford was disappearing. In its place came admiration. And then something even more important. An idea. A dangerous idea. Because Beckwith had begun asking a question that would eventually change American military history. If this system produced such remarkable soldiers, why didn't the United States have a unit like it? At the time, the question seemed harmless. But over the next 15 years, it would become an obsession. An obsession fueled by war, by failure, and by experiences that nearly cost Charles Beckwith his life. The mountains had changed his perspective. The jungles of Southeast Asia would change his future. The idea followed Charles Beckwith home. Long after he left Hereford. Long after he left the mountains of Wales. Long after he stopped wearing the SAS parachute wings he had earned during his exchange. The question remained. Why didn't America have a unit like this? At first, it was simply an observation. Then it became a conviction. Eventually, it became an obsession. But before Beckwith could convince anyone else, war would test him once again. The 1960s were becoming increasingly violent. Across Southeast Asia, conflicts were expanding. Governments were falling. Insurgencies were spreading. And the United States was becoming more deeply involved every year. For soldiers like Beckwith, it meant returning to dangerous places where survival was never guaranteed. The battlefield that awaited him was unlike anything most conventional armies had prepared for. Vietnam was not a war of clear front lines. The enemy appeared suddenly, then vanished. A patrol could move for days without contact, then find itself fighting for survival in seconds. The jungle hid everything. Movement, weapons, entire units. It was exactly the kind of environment where SAS methods made sense. Small teams, independent operators, intelligence-driven missions, flexibility over rigid doctrine. Again and again, Beckwith found himself remembering lessons from Hereford. And again, he saw evidence that those lessons worked. Then came the moment that nearly ended everything. During a combat operation, Beckwith and his men came under devastating enemy fire. The attack was sudden, violent, and incredibly accurate. Bullets tore through the jungle. Men dove for cover. Orders disappeared beneath the noise of gunfire. In the chaos, Beckwith was hit. The wound was severe. Blood poured from his body. Pain exploded through him. For a moment, death seemed frighteningly close. The situation quickly became desperate. Evacuation was difficult. Enemy fire continued. Every minute mattered. Somehow, he survived. But survival came at a cost. Recovery would take months. For many soldiers, such an experience would have ended ambitious plans. For Beckwith, it had the opposite effect. Lying in hospitals and recovery centers gave him time to think. Time to analyze. Time to remember everything he had learned from the SAS. The conclusion never changed. America needed a dedicated counter-terrorist and hostage rescue force. Not eventually. Not someday. Immediately. At the time, many senior military leaders disagreed. The United States already had elite units. The Green Berets. The Rangers. Specialized reconnaissance teams. To many officials, creating another organization seemed unnecessary. Beckwith saw things differently. The world was changing. Terrorism was becoming increasingly international. Aircraft hijackings were rising. Hostage crises were becoming common. Governments needed forces capable of responding rapidly and precisely. The SAS had already demonstrated what such a unit could achieve. America had not. Throughout the 1970s, Beckwith pushed relentlessly. He wrote proposals, delivered briefings, met senior commanders, repeated the same argument over and over. Most of the time, he encountered resistance. Military institutions rarely embrace radical change, especially when that change challenges established traditions. But Beckwith refused to quit. The same determination that had carried men across the Brecon Beacons now drove him. Years passed. The idea survived. Then the world provided evidence. Again and again, terrorist incidents dominated international headlines. Hostage situations became global spectacles. Governments struggled to respond effectively. Each crisis strengthened Beckwith's case. Still, progress remained painfully slow. Then came 1977. 15 years after arriving in Hereford. 15 years after dismissing the SAS as tea-drinking amateurs. The breakthrough finally arrived. The U.S. Army approved the creation of a new unit. A highly secretive organization designed specifically for counterterrorism and hostage rescue. Its official designation was 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Most people would know it by a simpler name, Delta Force. From the beginning, the SAS influence was impossible to miss. Selection standards mirrored the British model. Independent thinking was emphasized. Physical endurance remained essential. Mental resilience became even more important. Volunteers were pushed to their limits. Many failed. A small number succeeded. The process looked remarkably familiar to anyone who had spent time in Hereford. Because that was exactly the point. Beckwith was not creating something entirely new. He was adapting a proven formula. One refined through decades of combat experience. A formula he had once mocked. Now he was building America's future around it. Yet creating Delta Force was only the beginning. The true test would come when the unit faced a real crisis. A crisis that would capture the attention of the entire world. A crisis involving American hostages. A distant desert. And a mission that would end in fire, tragedy, and national humiliation. For Beckwith and Delta Force, the hardest lesson was still ahead.